Sorry about this. I just wanted to share the screen with the. You could see the final paper assignment. That's what I'm trying to do here. Okay, here we go. Final paper assignment. So, 6 to 8 pages long. So this is the only actual real paper for the course. Uh, so I mean, you're supposed to come up with your own uh, thesis that you want to argue for, um, and it actually can be anything you want as long as it's relevant to the course. However, there's a list of suggested topics, and that's what most people uh, use. So the suggested topics are they're not just like one sentence prompts. Some of them are kind of long, but it's basically because they include a lot of different options for how to approach the topic. So this isn't like a list of things that you should try to answer all these questions in your paper. They're just various questions about, right? So in this case, the main topic is in what sense can our authors be called empiricists? But then there's a lot of different angles that you might want to think of as you're trying to come up with an argument about that topic. So that's what these other sub questions are. Um, right? And there's a lot of and or because those are two different possibilities for approaching the topic. One would be and, the other would be or, and so forth. Um, as far as the instructions go, other than that, uh, what is there here that I'd want to talk about? Oh, well, the first thing, which is important, is that on Tuesday, I mentioned this at the beginning of the course, uh, an introductory paragraph and a brief outline for your paper are due. So you don't, uh, you're not obliged to use that introductory paragraph or follow that outline. Um, in fact, the idea of doing this is that you can get some feedback from your TA in between then and when you hand in the paper, and in that way, you could improve your introductory paragraph and change your outline. Um, so, um, and that part doesn't receive a separate grade. Uh, as long as you hand it in and it's not wholly unsatisfactory, which is supposed to be an extremely low bar, um, then that's okay. If you don't hand it in at all, or you hand in, basically gobbledygook or whatever. I mean, I've never had to use that uh, criterion, but it's there just, you know, to make sure that it's clear you actually have to hand in the assignment, not something else. So, right. So as long as you hand it in, that's fine. If you don't hand it in, then your grade on the final paper gets reduced one step. So you should hand it in, and even if it's not good at all, that will still prevent your final paper grade from being reduced. I don't know how the okay, so it says here there will be special section meetings. I just haven't changed this from the previous year's assignment. We don't have section meetings. I don't know if the TAs want to arrange some kind of live feedback sessions or just try to send you quick written feedback or what. Um, I guess I should find that out before next week. But in any case, there'll be some way to get some feedback from your TA after that. And let's see, I already mentioned that. Um, all the suggested topics require you to discuss at least two of the three authors from the course and compare them to each other. I think it's easier to write a good paper that way. It's harder to take, Locke head on and just try to say what he means. If you don't want to do that, uh, then you should probably talk to me or your TA about that. That's not a requirement, it's just advice. Um, I'm not advising you to use any outside material to write this paper, but if you do use outside material, then obviously you should cite it properly. If you quote it word for word, you should put it in quotation marks. If you don't quote it word for word, but you're basically following it, you should still have a footnote. Um, the only reason people ever fail uh, paper, I mean, I can't guarantee this will always continue forever, but let's say up until now, the only reason anyone has ever failed paper in one of my courses was because of plagiarism. So just please don't do that. Like if you use Wikipedia or whatever, just have a footnote. Wikipedia, it's maybe a little embarrassing, but you won't fail. um, okay, and let's see. And this one's also kind of important. The intent of the paper is to discuss the views or attitudes manifested in the reading rather than your own opinions on the topic, right? So in other words, don't write a paper about whether the external world exists or not. Write a paper about whether Hume thinks it exists or not. It's pretty simple, although I think it can be hard to understand if you're doing this kind of paper for the first time, like how it can avoid just being summary. Like, what is there to argue about here? But if you just think about what I do in my lectures all the time, um, it's really hard to understand uh, what, it's really hard to understand what Tuesday is the 2nd. Oops. It's also something I obviously forgot to change from last time. It is due. It's due when the syllabus says it's due. But if you thought because I just that it should be due on a Tuesday and you hand it in Tuesday, that will still be okay. I don't, whatever. But it's due when the syllabus says it's due. I'm sorry, there's an inconsistency between that and the assignment. Yeah, don't wait till the 4th. That would be too late, I think. Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Sorry. What was I talking about? Oh, right. So it actually is difficult to understand what Hume means, what Locke means, what Berkeley means, and especially it's difficult to figure out exactly what they agree or disagree about. And that's basically what these papers would be about. Right? So it is supposed to be your own original opinion, but it's supposed to be your own original opinion about what exactly Locke and Berkeley, for example, are arguing about, or what ways they're similar and what ways they're different. Ideally, you would say something interesting about that, right? Which means that the paper, number one, you shouldn't be able to break it down into one paper about Locke and one paper about Hume. It should be like one thesis that requires you to discuss both of them together. And again, ideally, it should be something kind of surprising and arguable about how they're related to each other. Is it okay to write about people? Well, Okay, let me read the question since the chat doesn't show up in the video. Is it okay to write about people who are not philosophers but have meaningful philosophies, artists, etc.? Well, it's okay to mention people like that, but again, the paper should be about the people we read in this course. That's, I mean, it's true the topics are only suggested topics, but that part is a requirement. It should be about the people we read in this course. It should be a paper written for this course. So, you know, if you think it helps to illuminate something about them to mention someone else, whether they're a philosopher or not, go ahead, but that shouldn't be like a huge proportion of the paper. Okay. Uh, Anything else here? Yeah, I was just talking about this, about what makes a good comparison paper. That's what makes a good comparison paper, you know. If all you can come up with is to say Locke said this, Berkeley said this, then it's, you know, not an A paper, but like, you know, do the best you can. All right. And right, there's no need to spend a lot of time fussing about citation formats, anything like that. Um, Journals in philosophy don't even, there's no standard format for citations, so I don't consider it worth trying to teach some format. It just, it has to be enough that the TA can figure out what you're citing and can find it if necessary. Okay, will we get grades back for the second short assignment? Yes, you will. Are the TAs both here? Are either of the TAs here? Oh, I think Anna actually mentioned she might not be able to be here today. And I know Sean sometimes is having trouble with his internet. So yes, you will get them back, but I don't know when you will get them back. If you want to know when you will get them back, you know, ask the TAs because they're grading them. Okay, are there any other questions about the final paper or about grades or anything like that? Okay, so now I will stop the share. Okay. Um, um, so there's some stuff I didn't get to at the end last time. Um, and but it's actually related to the first part of the reading for this time, so I'm going to say something that applies to both. Then I'm going to talk about what was left over from last time, namely the source of our belief in the continuation, in the continuing and independent existence of external things. Then I'll just briefly mention the ancient philosophy, which is the reading from this time. And then I'll spend more time talking about the modern philosophy and about the concluding section of book one, and which is really important. And I always run out of time to discuss it, but hopefully I won't today. Who can say? All right. So the thing that I said I wanted to talk about that really applies to a bunch of things in this reading is Hume's theory of identity, which, remember from our discussion of Locke, what identity means. Identity means sameness, right? So the question here is, what kind of relation is it that we call the relation of being the same? That is, or in Latin, identitas. And Hume's problem in this respect is the same problem that we saw in Locke. Um, Namely, that this relation of sameness seems to be a relation between something and itself. But a relation, as both Locke and Hume understand it, has to be a relation between two things. So it doesn't make sense to say that there's a relation between something and itself. So Hume says, first of all, the same thing Locke says about this. One single object conveys the idea of unity, not that of identity. Now, I mean, actually, Hume is speaking a little loosely here. Hume doesn't really think there is an idea of unity, I guess. Um, I'm not sure. Anyway, and I'm not sure the idea of identity is also going to be kind of strange if there is really such a thing. But he's saying, um, when we think about one object, we're thinking about it as one, not as identical. Identical implies it's identical to something, so there have to be two things. But then here's the other side of the dilemma. On the other hand, a multiplicity of objects can never convey this idea, however resembling they may be supposed. The mind always pronounces the one not to be the other. So whenever you're talking about more than one thing, by definition, you're talking about things that are different. And if they're different, they're not the same. So they're not identical. Oops, wrong one. No, still wrong one. So the issue for both Locke and Hume is um, how can we find a kind of middle ground between there being one thing and there being two or more things? But for simplicity, let's talk about two. Um, and both Locke and Hume answer that this middle ground, which seems like a contradiction in terms, right? I mean, either it's one or it's two. This middle ground exists because of the relationship between the same thing at different times. So their solutions are similar, but in another way, their solutions are the exact opposite of each other. And the reason is because of the difference between the way Locke and Hume see time. So if you recall, Locke's solution basically was this. This is the time axis and this is the space axis. So if you look at something at one time and then you look at a later time, Locke says you can find something that in certain respects or for certain purposes is the same as this. Right? So for example, if this is a tiny oak sapling, and then this time is like many years later, then you can find, I guess in this case it probably won't have moved very much. Actually, the land moves, right? So, well, anyway, never mind. Plus, the Earth is rotating. I don't know. Anyway, let's say it's in the same place. But it's a huge oak tree, right? Now, so is this the same as this? Well, no, obviously they're completely different. One is small and the other is big. But this is the same oak tree as this, Locke says, right? So in other words, for purposes of counting oak trees, we count this as the same, and Locke explains why, what criteria we use to decide that. But so but it seems like, so identity then is a relation between these two things. And the problem is solved because the two things are different. There really are two different things that this relation of identity holds between. But although they're absolutely speaking different, they're relatively identical. They're identical considered as oak trees, basically. Right? So taken as oak trees, they're the same, even though they're really two different things. Now, so it seems like, right, so Locke's solution to that question, is it one or is it two, is it's really two. And it seems like that's always Locke's solution, although this isn't 100% clear, but it seems that Locke thinks that two things at different times are never absolutely the same as each other. Right, so even in the perhaps primitive case, according to Locke, where this is the same small piece of matter, Locke thinks that the piece of matter at this time and the piece of matter at this time are really two different things because they're at different times, so they're not the same. Even though in this case they resemble each other exactly. So it seems like Locke's solution is that whatever kind of identity we're considering, it's always relative identity. It's never absolute identity. There is no such thing as absolute identity, because absolute identity would have to be a relation between a thing and itself, and a relation has to be between two things. But there are many different kinds of relative identity. Maybe one that's primitive, although he doesn't say this, but he kind of implies it maybe, and others that are somehow derived from that. But one way or the other, it's always, when you say this is the same as that, you're always talking about two different things at different times that you're considering as the same in some respect or for some purpose. Now, so I said that Hume's solution looks different because Hume thinks about time differently. And this is the difference. It's related to the disagreement between Locke and Hume about space. Remember, Locke thinks we have this idea of empty space, mere extension, which we can then imagine being filled in its pieces by different qualities or whatever. Hume says, no, the only idea of extension we have is either as colored or as solid. Again, I'm not sure why heat and cold are left out of that, but never mind. So similarly, in the case of time, Locke says we have this idea of an empty extension of time. Right? It contains just as many parts as it would if something were happening then. But either there's nothing there at all, or there's something there, but it's not changing. And that's actually the case that's going to be important. So there's something in this time, but it's not changing. Right? This always reminds me of this. Did I already mention this in this course? Maybe not. It always reminds me of this Beavis and Butthead episode about animation called Animation Sucks, where their teacher is like droning on about how great animation is because they're going to do animation in their class. And meanwhile, you know, he says it's wondrous because you can make a picture appear to move. And meanwhile, what you see on the screen is basically a still shot of Beavis and Butthead just sitting there. All right. Anyway, so that's, you know, that could be what's going on here. It's just Beavis looking exactly the same in every part of this duration, but it still has just as many parts as it would if there was an actual succession of different things, according to Locke. And Hume, again, says, no, we have no idea of time except as an actual succession. So when we have an actual idea of time passing in something, that means the thing is changing, according to Hume. So in particular, if any time passed between here and here, the thing must have changed in that interval, according to Hume. I mean, maybe at the end it's the same again. I don't know, but anyway, somewhere in here it had to not be different just because it's at a different time. That is what Hume is saying doesn't make sense. It had to change its qualities. Okay, when you were talking about how Locke has a bunch of circle diagrams in the back of some book a couple of weeks ago, is this this kind of thing about the same number of parts just moving around? That was actually Descartes who has a bunch of circle diagrams in the back of the Principles of Philosophy. No, we're not talking. This dimension is time. These are the things temporal parts. Right? In other words, if we went back, let's say the case of the oak tree growing is a case where Hume would say that we have an actual idea of time passing for the oak tree, right? And the way it works is that at the first time there's something that looks like this, and later there's something that looks like this, and later there's something that looks like this. Those are the temporal parts of the oak tree. Oh, thank you. There's a link to the Beavis and Butthead skit if you wish to watch it. Not during the lecture, I hope. Okay. So, right, so Hume says, so again, these aren't what we usually call parts of the oak tree. They're not its spatial parts. They're its temporal parts, right? Part of it is this little thing at this time, and another part is this big thing at another time. So, but Hume says, that is, according to Locke, all the temporal parts of something can exactly resemble each other. So it could just draw Beavis here, 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 exactly the same. And Locke would say, Locke doesn't talk about temporal parts, but I'm not even sure if Hume actually uses that language anywhere. But that's what he would be talking about, right? So he would say it has a part at this time and another part at this time that are exactly similar. So whereas Hume is saying the whole idea of time passing only comes from the actual succession of impressions. If the impression remains the same throughout, then we get no idea of time passing from it. So the temporal parts are the same. Well, okay, I mean, what the same means is what we're arguing about here, right? So, but the temporal parts in the oak tree case, and the oak tree case maybe is not a good case because it's not actually, think about something where I watch it happening. Because in the end, for Hume, this is going to be about impressions, right? So, like, you know, I watch the second hand moving on the watch. I see it here, I see it here, I see it here. As I watch it, it changes. Hume says that's where we get the idea of time. So Hume says what we can't have is something like this. Imagine these pictures look exactly like each other. Of course they don't, but imagine they look exactly like each other. So Hume says, you know, you can't have this because we only get the idea of time from succession. So if there's no succession, there's no basis to separate it into those three parts. So this is weird. What Hume says happens. Suppose that I'm looking at something that's not changing. And meanwhile, I'm thinking, oh, that's not changing. I wonder what's, you know, I wonder what's for dinner tonight. What's that over there? Whatever. So what that looks like, according to Hume, is Like, suppose what's not changing is this, it's like, I can't really draw Beavis. Suppose it's just this table, right? So I'm just staring at this table. It's not moving, color's not changing, the shape isn't changing, nothing changes at all while I'm watching it. But meanwhile, I'm thinking. So here's the table. And here's some of my other ideas and impressions. And remember, this is the vulgar view that we're talking about at this stage. So according to the vulgar view, the table and my impression of the table are the same thing. So like the philosophers would say, this is all happening in my mind. The question, of course, is how the vulgar come to believe that it's not, that the table is independent of my mind. But we haven't got to that yet. So in this case, suppose I'm looking at the table the whole time, so there's no question about its continuous and independent existence. And meanwhile, I'm having other impressions or ideas going through my mind, and they're always changing. So according to Hume, all of these things are really simultaneous with one thing. In other words, when I drew this time axis here, I was actually getting ahead of myself. There isn't really, according to Hume, there isn't like a coordinated succession that happens for everything together. The table that doesn't change, there's just one time at which it is, one simple time, because there's no change in it to provide a basis for separating it into temporal parts. These things that change are all at different times because there's a succession of them. So all these different times are simultaneous with this one time. Right? So according to Hume, you can't, to say in general relativity theory, I think the term is foliation, but you can't divide the whole progress of the universe by making like sheets that are all simultaneous, one after another. One thing, there's one time that remains simple, while a whole bunch of other times are simultaneous with it. Okay, so that's a weird thing. It sounds very strange. And Hume says it sounds strange because our imagination immediately leads us astray and makes us not notice it. And it makes us not notice it by fictionally separating this one simple time into many temporal parts. Right? So I invent parts of this table impression that are simultaneous with all my other ideas and impressions that are changing. It's really simple, but I pretend that it has one part that's simultaneous with this impression or the idea, and one that's simultaneous with this, and one that's simultaneous with that, etc. And that's how we come to believe that time marches on for everything together. And that there's a length of time that something lasts, even if it doesn't change during that time. That's all a fiction, according to Hume. So, I mean, that in itself, in some ways, is more interesting than the theory of identity. It's certainly a strange thing to say about time, but speaking of time, I don't have more time to talk about it. So I'm just going to say, so how does this affect Hume's theory of identity? Well, so according to Hume, the relation of identity is the relation of identity, strictly speaking, absolute identity. So unlike Locke, he believes in absolute identity. And what is absolute identity? Well, it's a fictional relation between these fictional parts of something that doesn't change. So whereas Locke's answer, remember the dilemma is identity a relation between two things? But then it wouldn't be identity because they'd be different. Or is it a relation between one thing? But that doesn't make sense because the relation has to be between two things. Locke's answer was, well, it's really a relation between two things, but we're treating them as the same. They're relatively identical. Hume's solution is that it's really a relation, quote unquote, between one thing which we're fictionally treating as two. Right? We're treating these as two different things, even though they're really the same thing. And the way I just said same there, even though they're really the same thing, that's the relation of absolute identity. The fictional relation between these two fictionally different things that are really one thing. Okay, so are there questions about that so far? Oh, okay, here's a question. So for Hume, we get time from moments being different, but time is singular to things that aren't different. Yes, I think you have the right idea. Yes, these are really at different times. So there really are different times here. But this is really at one time because there really is only one time here since there's no change. And we get identity by pretending that there's more than one time there. And then once we pretend there's more than one time there, we can pretend there's a relation between the two. Between the thing at this time and the thing at this time. But since it's pretend, there's really only one thing, and that's why we call it identity, that is sameness. Okay, so so that's the theory of identity, and then Hume uses that to explain. It's interesting. What he's basically explaining is all the cases that, according to Locke, are amount to the perfectly reasonable attribution of relative identity. Right? Like, so for example, if I have the table impression here, and then I look away and I look at other stuff, and then I have the table impression again, and these exactly resemble each other, and I say it's the same table impression. So Locke can interpret that as being completely correct and rational. Namely, he can say, yeah, this is how we count table impressions. Even though these are two different impressions, they count as the same table impression because the right kind of relationship holds between them. They exactly resemble each other. There's an explanation for why I didn't see them in between, etc. Whatever you want to throw in there. That's how we decide whether to treat two table impressions as the same or not. That's going to be Locke's type of explanation for anything like this. Hume looks at those same things and says that it's a confused and erroneous attribution of absolute identity. Right? So Hume's explanation for our belief in the continuous existence of external things, the vulgar version, starts with saying that we confuse this relation of resemblance with the relation of identity. So again, the relation of identity would have been that there's just one table impression. And we want to say there's one table impression that lasts the whole time. But again, according to Hume, that's the fiction, right? What there really is, I'm sorry, it's out of focus now. That's the fiction, right? There really is just one table impression, period. By a fiction, we separate it into table impressions at this time, at this time, and at this time. And the relation of identity is this fictional relation between those two fictional moments of the table's existence. Again, there's really only one moment of the table's existence, the table impression's existence, which for the vulgar is the same as the table, right? So we confuse this situation with this situation where there are two, and I guess it's important, although Hume doesn't make this entirely clear, but I think what we have to say is there are two, for all we can tell, completely different table impressions. One that we saw here and one that we saw here, and in between there was no table impression, right? So, this is the example where I'm looking at the table and I close my eyes and then I open my eyes again. Or I'm looking at the table and I turn around and I turn around again. So Hume says these are completely different situations. Here we have one impression, and here we have, at least to all appearances, two completely different impressions. One at this time and one at that time. Okay, so there's another question. First of all, there was one question. So is it two tables? Is this situation two tables? Well, I mean, what we're trying to explain here is why, even though, so remember, the vulgar identify the impressions with the external objects. So there's what certainly appears to be two different table impressions here. So we expect the vulgar to say there's two tables. One table at the first time and then another table at the later time. But instead, the vulgar say, no, the table, meaning the table impression, was there the whole time, even though I wasn't perceiving it. There's only one table. That's what they say, and Hume is trying to explain why they say it. That was the answer to the first question. So is it two tables? Second question. So if we look away from the table or look at it from a different angle, it isn't unified, but two different through resembling impressions. Yeah, maybe I should have stuck with the closing my eyes thing rather than turning away. Turning away is confusing because because there's other table impressions from other angles in between or whatever. But yeah, so let's just keep it simple. It's the case where I close my eyes and then I open them. And so fast that I don't see the table like half covered by my eyelid or whatever. Okay, so there's two different table impressions, but we're assuming, at least at first, that they resemble each other exactly. Right? So this is the case where what we would normally say is the table didn't change while my eyes were closed. But the table impression certainly seems to have changed because it wasn't here in between. And, so how could this be the same as that? So, but Hume says that what leads to the vulgar view, and remember the vulgar view according to Hume is the view that we all believe, even philosophers, as soon as we stop thinking about this. So what leads to the vulgar view, first of all, is a confusion between this relation of resemblance and this fictional relation of identity. And so the way it works is when we remember this sequence here, that is, we have ideas that are copies of these impressions, we feel, because of the relation of resemblance, and in this case it's exact resemblance, we feel that it's very easy to slide from this idea to this idea. That is, the memory of this and the memory of that exactly resemble each other. There's an exact relation of resemblance between them. So because of the principles of association, we quickly go from one to the other. Now, when we remember this sequence, the memory of this and the memory of this are actually the exact same idea, right? Because there was only one impression here. So there is nothing to do to slide from one to the other. It's just the same idea. But Hume says the feeling of those two is very similar, right? So like the feeling of just having one idea, but fictionally attributing it to two different moments, is very similar to the feeling of having two ideas that I correctly attribute to two different moments, but that exactly resemble each other. Because the difference between the two ideas is like easily skipped over by the mind. So I confuse this relation of resemblance with this relation, quote unquote, of identity. I mean, it's sort of a relation, sort of not. It's a fictional relation, right? But although it's a fictional relation, there's a feeling of considering it. There's what it's like for the mind to think of something as identical. And it's very similar to the feeling of considering this. And so Hume says, whenever we have things that resemble each other, we tend to confuse them with each other. So, I mean, there's a funny footnote about this where he says, like, this theory is hard to understand, but it's hard to understand for the exact reason I'm talking about. Why? Because there's two relations of resemblance here. This relation of resemblance between this table impression and this table impression, and this relation of resemblance between this relation of resemblance and the relation of identity. So there's two relations of resemblance here, and they're both relations of resemblance, so they resemble each other, and so it's easy to confuse them. So Hume says that's why it's hard to focus on the details of this theory. But I think, thinking about what I just said and what Hume says in that footnote doesn't help. It actually makes it worse. It increases the confusion. So it's better to just think about this picture and say there's a relation of resemblance, there's a relation of identity, they're similar, and therefore we tend to confuse them with each other. So we start thinking that these two table impressions are identical. We can't resist thinking that, Hume says, because this similarity is so great that the imagination always makes us go back, no matter what, to thinking of these as identical. But on the other hand, whenever we really focus on what happened here and remember all this stuff that happened in between, we say, well, wait, those aren't identical. They're two different impressions. So there's a contradiction. There's a contradiction between what we're naturally led to think when we're not paying attention to this stuff that happened in between, and what we are forced to think when we do pay attention to the stuff that happened in between. And Hume says this makes the mind uneasy. The mind is always uneasy with this kind of contradiction. And when the mind is uneasy with a contradiction, what it does is the imagination But again, I think the fact that the imagination does this is just a way of saying the mind does it even though it's not rational or something like that. The imagination comes up with a fiction to reconcile the contradiction, and that's what we'll believe. So what's the fiction that reconciles the contradiction in this case? So the fiction is, and this, it's really interesting what the fiction is. This is, mere resemblance. This is true identity. These are the things we're confusing with each other. And here's the fiction the mind comes up with to reconcile them. It says, the impression of the table there actually is only one table impression. Oh wait, there's a question. Would it be fair to say that identity is a vulgar idea if it's really a confusion of resemblance and unity? Well, okay, hold on a second. So there's two different things. Like, I guess you could say identity, period, is a kind of vulgar just means it's common, right? It's certainly vulgar in that sense. We all have an idea of identity. But yeah, identity itself, in even absolute identity, results from a kind of fiction of the imagination. But the fiction is the difference part, not the sameness part. Right? So there really is only one thing. The fiction is that there's a relation that characterizes there being only one thing. But in this case, and I mean, by the way, like the more extreme fictions in this respect are the ones invented by philosophers, not by the vulgar, right? That's what section 3 on the ancient philosophy is about. The vulgar invent a pretty simple fiction. Oh, or I guess there would be at least two ways people consider identity if people mistake both things for identity. Right. I mean, one is absolute true identity, and the other, as I was saying, is all those cases where Locke says, well, it's identity relative to this. Hume says it's not really identity, but we think it is. We mistake it for identity. Okay, so anyway, getting back to this, what's the fiction that the mind invents? So the fiction that the mind invents is that there really was only one table impression. Wait, how could that be? This stuff happened in between. So the answer is that although there was only one table impression, I didn't continuously perceive that table impression. Remember, what we're heading for here is that an impression can exist independently of the mind. That's what the vulgar believe, and this is where that comes in, right? So that the vulgar say, here was my mind, here was the table impression. The table impression was constant, but it wasn't present to my mind the whole time. Now, I mean, it's easy to get this confused with what the philosophers would say, which is that the table object existed external to my mind, and there were two different impressions that represented it, one here and one here. But that's not what the vulgar are saying, right? The vulgar are saying, maybe I shouldn't even draw dots here, right? The vulgar are saying the table impression, the thing that I immediately perceive, was here the whole time, but I just wasn't perceiving it in between. And in between, I had other ideas and impressions. So this is a fiction that the table impression has a continuing existence. And Hume says that's what comes first. Right? What comes first is the belief that the table impression exists even when it's not present to my mind. But then, as Hume said before, continuing existence implies independent existence, right? Because it exists even when it's not present to my mind. Obviously, its existence doesn't depend on its being perceived by my mind, right? Its esse is not percipi, or percipi, as Berkeley would say, right? It has its own existence. So this is how the vulgar come to believe in the continuing and independent existence of external things. And Hume says there's no contradiction in this. Berkeley would say, and does say, this is an absurdity that the vulgar come to believe here. But Hume says, no, it's not absurd. What does it amount to when I say that some impression is present to my mind or is perceived by me? Berkeley says it means that it inheres in my spirit, which is not an idea, which is a substance, etc. Hume thinks we have no ideas of any of that stuff. Well, I mean, okay, Berkeley agrees we have no ideas of any of that stuff. So the difference of opinion is a little bit tricky here. But Berkeley thinks we're really expressing something when we talk about that stuff, namely our will, our power, and Hume thinks we're not. It's just words. So therefore, what does it amount to according to Hume when I say that a certain impression is present to my mind? And the answer, he says, is what I call my mind is just a heap of impressions that are related to each other in certain ways. This is actually close to Locke's view of personal identity, except again, for Hume, it's erroneous that I think of myself as identical because of this. I'm not really identical. There's a bunch of different ideas and impressions that come one after another that are connected to each other by relations of desire and memory and so on and so forth, and that's what I call my mind. And so any of those things could exist without those relations. They could exist without those relations, without ever having those relations, or, as in this case, they could sometimes have those relations and sometimes not. No contradiction. So the vulgar have created a fiction which is not absurd, according to Hume. However, according to Hume, although it's not absurd, it's certainly false. So it could be that there are mind-independent impressions that that exist even when I'm not perceiving them, and I sometimes perceive them and sometimes don't. But we can tell that what we call external objects are not like that. And Hume says, for example, press your finger against your eyeball. All of a sudden, there are twice as many impressions as there were before. Right? So if you had one impression of this pen, and you press your eyeball, now you have two. So he says, which one is the real pen? They're the same. These two impressions are the same. There's no basis for saying one is the real pen and the other is only an image. And yet, by doing something that affected my organs, not the pen, I made these two impressions happen. So I have a choice. I can continue to say, as the vulgar do, that the impression is the pen. And that means that by affecting my organ and not doing anything to the pen, I've doubled it. I've made a new pen. So obviously, at least by the usual principles of cause and effect, I should conclude that the pen's existence depends on me. Because I can cause a new pen to exist by pushing my eyeball. Right? Or, so, I mean, or if I'm not willing to say that, but I still want to believe in the continuing and independent existence of external objects, I have to go the philosopher's route. And this is where the philosophical view comes from, according to Hume. It comes from noticing that the fiction that the vulgar have invented and that we all believe in most of the time is certainly false. But not being willing to give up on this very strong inclination we have to treat external objects as having a continuing and independent existence. So again, we have this contradiction, and again, the mind is uneasy with it, and again, the imagination invents a fiction to reconcile. But this time, the fiction that it invents is wilder, right? Because now it says, oh, okay, so the table is not the same as the table impression. The table is some other thing out here that affects me.
Dad, your hand is kind of laggy on this.
Yes, my hand is laggy because Manicam is slow, but yeah, that's just the way it is. All right. So the table impressions, the philosophers say, sure enough, they're in the mind and their existence depends on the mind. And that's why, to switch the example, if I was looking at the table and I pressed my eyeball, there would suddenly be two table impressions. The table impressions are in me. But there still is one thing that continues to exist even while I'm not looking at the table. And that's not the table impression, but the table itself. The body that actually is the table. And these impressions, the philosophers say, are caused by the table, and they represent the table, and they represent the table by resembling it. So the thing that's out here, I drew it, first of all, just as a squiggle, but the philosophers are compelled, according to Hume, and according to Berkeley also, although Berkeley thinks it's absurd, the philosophers are compelled to say that at least in some respects, the external table resembles my impressions of it. So, for example, it's the same shape as my impressions of it. Something like that. At least it's the same shape to touch. Right? Because remember, I've been talking, and Hume mostly talks about this too, about this as if our main way of observing bodies was vision. But I think ultimately Locke and Hume and Berkeley all agree that the real way we perceive bodies is by touch, feeling them, right? And that even though the visible shape of a table changes as I walk around it and so forth, the tactile shape is what doesn't change. It has one tactile shape. And that's what the philosophers are going to end up saying is the same as the shape of the table itself. The shape of the tactile impressions is the same as the shape of the table itself. All right. And that's how we get, that's how we get, first of all, the ancient philosophy, which attributes all kinds, which is basically Aristotelianism, which attributes all the sensible qualities like color and smell and everything to the external table. And then I see I don't really have time to get into the ancient philosophy at all. But what Hume says is the ancient philosophy, Hume says about the ancient philosophy is that it really is a continuation of what the vulgar did to begin with. The imagination continues to invent, we continue to come across various related contradictions, even after we've invented this. And the imagination reconciles them one after another with various more and more wild fictions. Right? Like, so for example, we invent a fiction that when the tree changed from the small tree to the big tree, there was one simple thing that was the same throughout. And there were other things that changed. And that's how we reconcile thinking these are identical with thinking that it changed. So, right, so that's where the doctrine of substance and accident comes from and so forth. That's the ancient philosophy. So the ancient philosophy, in a way, is perfectly natural, Hume says. It's the only problem with it is basically that the fictions that it invents are irregular, incoherent with each other and with the common vulgar view, and they're weak. It's not the same kind of strong, irresistible tendency of the imagination that we found in the belief in cause and effect, or in the belief in behind the belief in the existence of external objects. There's a question. Does Hume think tactile shape exists? It is not as though we can feel the whole table at once. Yeah, that's a good question. But I mean, we can feel more than one part of it at once, at least. I mean, ultimately, okay, when I get to the modern philosophy, which I'm going to get to in a second, we're going to see that in a way, Hume thinks that Locke has gone wrong by believing that there's such a thing as tactile shape. But let me put that off. Right. So, what was I going to say? Right. So, in a way, Hume. Oh, right. So, unlike these irresistible tendencies of the imagination that make us believe in cause and effect and in the existence of external things, the fictions that the ancient philosophy come up with are relatively weak and irregular, and therefore, in principle, we can suppress them. And Hume says we should, right? Like we shouldn't believe this weird Aristotelian stuff. Okay, so the modern philosophy, which basically means Locke. I mean, Locke and Descartes, maybe it's Locke's version of it that he's talking about. So I believe Hume thinks the modern philosophy actually is an attempt to get away from all these tendencies of the imagination and bring reason to bear on this question. Reason still including the belief in cause and effect, but nothing else beyond that, I guess you would say. So, because we're keeping reason, including the belief in cause and effect, the modern philosophers, or in other words, Locke, conclude that the secondary qualities can't really resemble anything in the external object. And this is because the secondary qualities appear different from different points of view. They appear different to different people. To use Locke's example, they appear different to the two hands of the same person when you stick them in the same water, right? And different effects can't both resemble the same cause, right? So the cause must not resemble them. Okay, I mean, I left out some of the complications there, but since I really want to get to that last section, I'm going to leave out a lot of complications and just say, so the modern philosophers say, okay, the secondary qualities, this external object really only resembles the internal object in its primary qualities. What are the primary qualities? Basically, extension and solidity and the other things that go along with that, like figure, motion, etc. Not color. So Hume says, I think, that you can sum up Hume's response to this by saying, well, it's admirable that you tried to get back to only reason and get rid of all these fictions of the imagination. The only problem is, as will always happen, Hume believes, when you try to do that, reason ends up undermining itself. And how does it undermine itself in this case? And I'll just say it pretty briefly. Um, so um, Hume tries to show that we can't think of extension without secondary qualities. We can't conceive of extension without secondary qualities. We have no idea of an extended thing that doesn't have secondary qualities, and in particular, the quality it has to have is color. Again, you might think heat and cold could fit in here, but he doesn't. So the quality that it must have is color. Now, so how does he argue for that? So, I mean, remember that in general, according to Hume, for any two different things, you can conceive them separate from each other. So how can it be that we can't conceive extension without color? And the answer is there's basically, well, there might be more, but there's basically two exceptions to that rule, that for any two different things, you can think them apart from each other. One is you can't think a part without the whole without the parts. And the other is you can't think a negation. Oh, oops. I'm going to erase this now. You can't think a negation without the positive idea that it's negating. Right? I mean, these are both things that we've seen Hume appeal to before. So, you can't have an idea of not X except as a version of the idea of X, basically. And you can't have an idea of a compound idea without the ideas of its parts. That's what it's compounded of. So, so there's two parts to the argument. The first, which is really a repetition of what he said in part 2 when he was talking about the ideas of space and time, is to say that extension is a compound idea, so it can't be thought of except by thinking of the ideas of its simple parts. And its simple parts we can't think of them as just not extended. We have to think of them as having some quality. And the quality, it's not clear how we know this, but the quality must be color or solidity. So we can't think of extension except as colored or solid. So, I mean, so far this sounds okay for Locke because he wants to say that extension is solid. But now Hume says we can't think of extension, we can't think of solidity by itself. And for that he appeals to this. And he says, what is solidity? Solidity is the idea of two bodies approaching each other but being unable to penetrate each other. And Hume says there's two ways to look at this, I think. That may be easier to understand ways. Hume just says, what two bodies are approaching each other and don't penetrate each other? I must say what their characteristics are. Again, I can't say they're just extension. I have to say extension of what? And of course, if I say solidity, then I'm involved in a circle. right? Therefore, I must say something else besides solidity, and it can only be color, right? So that when I conceive of two bodies hitting but not being unable to penetrate, I'm thinking of them as colored. The more complicated way of understanding it is to say, what is it for two bodies not to penetrate, according to Hume? And the answer that he already gave to that before is that, well, I guess what would it be for them to penetrate each other? And what it would be for them to penetrate each other is for them to be annihilated, or one of them to be annihilated, and only the other one to remain. Only we can't tell which is annihilated. That's what we would call penetration, right? So this one approaches this one, and then assume these are simple, actually, like tiny, simple bodies, the smallest they could be. They approach each other. They're right next to each other, and then the next instant, there's only one. So we say one of them went into the other one. They penetrated each other. Now we're saying, but these bodies are solid, so they can't penetrate each other. So we're saying they won't be annihilated by this contact. But what won't be annihilated? Right? That is, to think of it being annihilated, we have to think of it as having some quality. And that's where I think he most clearly appeals to this principle. I mean, he explicitly appeals to it. We have to, what could have been annihilated but wasn't? It must be some positive quality. It can't be solidity, because again, we would be involved in a circle. It must be color. Therefore, Hume's conclusion is that we can't conceive of this supposed thing with only primary qualities. We must consider it as colored. Now, which is a secondary quality. Okay, now what about the modern philosopher's arguments that the secondary qualities couldn't characterize external objects because that would violate the usual rules of cause and effect? So Hume says, sure enough, and this is why in section 7 that I'm going to talk about next, his melancholy conclusion is that the principle of imagination that leads us to believe in the law of cause and effect, and the other principle of imagination that leads us to believe in the continued and independent existence of external objects, both of which are so strong as to be irresistible, actually are not consistent with each other. So if we think too hard about it, and this is what happened to the modern philosophers, we'll realize that we can't believe both of the things we're compelled to believe. I mean, we shouldn't. That is, according to reason, we shouldn't because it's a contradiction. But we must, because these principles of the imagination are so strong. So again, as I said, reason has undermined itself, right? Reason has shown that we ought to believe something, but also that we can't believe it. Okay, are there questions about this before I go on to section 7? I never did get back to the thing about the tactile shape. It's just yeah, it's probably too complicated to get into, but okay. All right, so book 1, part 4, section 7 is basically, I mean, it belongs to part 4, but it's really the conclusion of book 1 and the transition to book 2. books 2 and 3, really. Um, it's very interesting how it was written, I think, or how it's written. I think I've mentioned this before, that it's an elaborate dramatic fiction. It's very much like Descartes' Meditations. I know that not everyone has had 100B, and therefore I can't assume that everyone has read Descartes' Meditations, but I figure a lot of people have, so I'll say it's very much like Descartes' Meditations. In Descartes' Meditations, there's a first-person narrator who says, some years ago, I noticed that many of my old beliefs were false, and I thought that once in my life I should try to doubt everything, and, now I have the leisure to do it. And then there's a whole story. I'm sitting by my table, in my dressing gown with a piece of wax, and, at one point at the end of the first meditation, the narrator is going to sleep in order to wake up and think about these things again tomorrow, right? There's a whole story. But obviously, at least if you think about it, I believe it's obvious, this is not literally a transcript of Descartes' stream of consciousness, right? In other words, it's not like we're really listening in on what Descartes thought the first time he ever considered these things, and knowing where Descartes was and what he was wearing or whatever. It's a fictional composition with a fictional first-person narrator. And it's probably one reason for doing it that way is that we're kind of supposed to identify with this narrator, right? So this isn't supposed to be an argument that just works for Descartes. That would be uninteresting, right? Why should I care if Descartes knows that he exists, and Descartes knows that the external world exists and that God exists and so forth? I want to know whether I exist and whether I should believe the external world exists and so forth, right? So the Meditations is written in such a way as to allow me to identify with the narrator and go through this argument for myself. So Book 1, Part 4, Section 7 has a similar strategy. Only what the narrator goes through is not a series of arguments. It's a series of moods or temperaments or tempers or humors. But I mean, so these basically mean moods, only Hume is calling them humors or tempers because he keeps up kind of throughout the section or throughout a large part of it this allusion to the ancient theory of the four humors, right? There are four humors, yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. One of them is hot and dry, one of them is cold and dry, one of them is cold and moist, and one is hot and moist. And depending on how these humors are mixed, first of all, depending on how they're mixed throughout the body, that determines whether you're healthy or sick. But depending on the mixture of the humors within the brain, it depends whether if you have the right mixture, then you have the correct, I guess, like sane and sober mental state. But if one of the humors predominates too much, then you're driven into one of these tempers. And temper or temperament literally means mixture, right? So we're talking about a mixture where one of the humors predominates. So I mean, maybe I should have skipped over that, but I don't know. Um, but I think it is helpful for following what happens. So there are basically three stages that this narrator goes through. Call the narrator Hume. But again, it's not as if, when Hume gets to one point, he says, my present mood, he goes through basically the whole thing up to reason undermines itself and there's no stable way of making it happy. I don't know whether to, what principles of the imagination to admit and which not to admit and whatever. And he says, fortunately, nature has prevented this kind of abstruse reasoning from affecting us too much. And then he stops and says, but what am I saying? In my present humor of melancholy and delirium, the conclusion of these arguments affect me a lot. I feel despair, right? Melancholy means that black bile, melancholy, right? That black bile predominates in this mixture. So I'm, in this mood I'm in now, I feel like I can't get away from the conclusions of these arguments. And it's terrible because no one's going to listen to me, and yet I can't bear to mix with them because I see all the errors they're involved in, and, I'm going to draw hatred on myself and whatever. Now, so when Hume writes, but wait, what am I saying? In this mood I'm in now, I mean, it's not the case that every stage between when he first wrote those in and when the book was printed, he was in that mood. So it's not true. And you can tell because as you read further on, he says, well, there's no cure for this except to wait a while and think about other stuff. And he mentions some things he does, like talk to his friends or play backgammon. And he says, after a while, the tempers, the humors readjusts, the mixture of humors changes, and I'm no longer in the state of melancholy. And then he starts writing, saying, in my present state, that is, in my present state, so the state that comes after melancholy and delirium, is called the state of spleen and indolence. And spleen, so it was thought that, so these humors, like there isn't really such a thing as black bile, I guess. There is something we still call bile. That's what they used to call yellow bile. Yellow bile or bile is actually generated in the liver, but they thought it was generated in the spleen. And when yellow bile predominates, you get angry. So spleen and indolence means anger and laziness. It's an interesting combination. And what happens in this mood, Hume says, that indolence means I'm no longer inclined to follow out these abstruse reasonings and be affected by their conclusions. Well, I'm kind of really lagging now, but oh well. And you know what? It's because I didn't quit Firefox. That's why I'm having catch. Okay. So indolence, I'm no longer inclined to look into these abstruse questions. I'm thinking about backgammon now and whatever. But the spleen part is that I have enough memory of what it was like to be in this state of melancholy that it makes me angry. It makes me angry at what? It makes me angry at the difficult philosophy that made me so miserable. And so Hume says, in this state right now, I feel like throwing all my books into the fire. Like stop animation now or something. Animation sucks. I look like Beavis and Butthead now. All right. Anyway, so and Hume says again, what can be done about this? Is there some way that I can be persuaded that no, philosophy is actually a good thing, and you shouldn't throw your books into the fire and whatever? Hume says, no, not really. It's the same thing again. I just have to wait. Wait a while. This mood will pass. I'll return to a temper of good humor and seriousness. And in this state, so good humor, I'm not sure whether by this he means that the blood predominates, which would mean it's a sanguine humor, or whether he means that it's a perfect balance, one or the other. But in any case, I get to this new state of good humor and seriousness. And in this state, I start thinking, yeah, I would like to think about some abstruse arguments again. I'm kind of tired of backgammon. Let me, hopefully I haven't thrown my books into the fire in between. Let me, look into some of this stuff. Now, I mean, he doesn't go back to this. And that's why this is a transition to book 2 and 3. He says, let me consider some of these questions about the passions and about ethics and politics, which I've always been so interested in. And I don't remember that abstruse arguments have gotten me in trouble in the past. I mean, I remember, but it no longer produces a strong impression as it did in this stage. And so I'm ready to start doing this. And that means to go on to book 2 and 3, or in our case, to the second inquiry, and think about ethics and politics. Not remembering or not taking seriously anymore that reason is not really something we can rely on too far. But, seeing, okay, sometimes I like using it. I'm not going to stop myself from using it just because of these skeptical doubts. I'm going to do whatever feels pleasant at the moment. And Hume says, and this is, I don't have time for more, so this is the last thing I'm going to say about this, that's the true skepticism. The true skeptic is not someone who constantly tries to remember that reason is no good for anything and lets that interfere with their life. The true skeptic is someone who notices once in a while that you can only take reason so far before it undermines itself, and therefore doesn't let this whole reason thing worry them. They reason when they feel like reasoning, and when it gets uncomfortable, they stop. And so that's how Hume is portraying himself. And that, I guess, is the introduction to how, after all this skepticism, he can go on in the reading for next week to seemingly forget that there's any problem with the existence of other people, the external world, or whatever. He's pushing things as far as he feels like, and that's what we have to expect. Okay, I will see you then.